Hello, everybody. Welcome to How to Plan for Security, Risk, and Compliance when Migrating to AWS. My name is Rob Barnes. I'm an AWS Cloud Security Architect. I'll be joined a little bit later by Amedeo Minutolo from the ECMC group. Now, I understand we have the lunch coma session, so if you are planning on taking a nap during this session, I have really good news for you, and I'm going to get to the point really quickly. So how do you plan for security, risk, and compliance? Early and often. Thank you, good night. I'm out. So if you're new to AWS, you are in a really good position right now to plan for security, risk, and compliance to establish a sound security foundation from the get-go. If you are an existing AWS user, it's a really good time to evaluate your security posture, your security foundation. Security is never done. It's a continuous process. I have a great job at AWS working with security because security truly is never done. It is a continuous process. So, I have a question. What is this? It's a Lego brick. It's a yellow 2x4. Officially, by the Lego brand building block company. Is it secure? I don't know, maybe. Depends on what it's securing. If the security requirements are to be a yellow 2x4 brick, then sure, it's secure. What about this? Is this secure? Heck yeah, it's a castle. The question is it more secure than the yellow 2x4 brick? Again, it depends on what your security requirements are. Now, this castle has, well, it's a lot of bricks. And it's got knights, it's got horses, it's got archers, it's got a freaking drawbridge. It's got to be more secure, but it's also, that's more expensive. Right? I've got horses I've got to feed, I've got knights and archers, I have to pay them a salary, I have to pay them health insurance, although if the battles aren't very long, maybe that's not very much. Have to pay them retirement. They're wearing armor, so now I have to pay for a blacksmith. I've got my archers on a turret. They need to get up to the turret, so I probably have a stairwell up there to get them there. So now I'm building an infrastructure simply to support my security infrastructure. So even though this might be more secure than a 2x4 brick, it's also a heck of a lot more expensive. It's more operationally complex. So there's got to be somewhere in the middle. Maybe your organization needs a brick. Maybe your organization needs a castle. Or maybe there's something in the middle. So when I work with customers, one of the first questions tends to be, well, where do I start? Where do I start with security? How do I meet my compliance requirements in AWS? And a very natural answer that I provide is, what do you have to do? What are your compliance requirements? So this is a public sector summit, so I imagine there's a lot of government agency representation here, perhaps nonprofit organizations, nonprofit healthcare organizations, and you have very unique compliance requirements. If you're a government agency, perhaps you have to follow NIST 800-53 or PCI. If you're managing payment card information, you have to follow the PCI DSS. So start there. These are the things you have to do. Some of my customers say, that's great. I want to start here, but that's not enough. We have our own organizational risk-based requirements that exceed or that are on top of what I'm forced to do, what I have to do. So it's important then to understand organizationally what your compliance requirements are. It's not just this, it's also what you have to do organizationally. What are your own risk-based requirements? If you are managing healthcare information, for example, there are some very specific things you need to do. You have to encrypt the healthcare data, right? You have to control access to that data. You have to log access to that data. You have to retain that data for some period of time. If you have payment card data, well, you have to encrypt that data. You have to control access to that data. you have to audit access to that data. You have to retain the data for some period of time. If you're following NIST 800-53, well, you have to encrypt your sensitive data. I mean, you see where this is going. So regardless of what your compliance requirements are, guess what? The dirty little secret is that the security controls are functionally equivalent. Well, you're going to encrypt the data the same way. You're going to control access the same way. So I'm going to show you in a few minutes an easy way in AWS where you can meet some of these compliance requirements. So we'll get there in a few minutes. But before I do, I'm going to get a little Sesame Street on you. I'm going to introduce you to the bowels of security, risk, and compliance, making its debut. We'll start with A. A is for automate. Automate everything. Eventually. So think of AWS as a crawl, walk, run sort of process. If you're new to AWS, well, heck, how can you automate where you're not really sure what you have? Or maybe you don't know what you can automate. So it's a very natural thing in AWS to log into the console, poke around, manually provision resources, manually provision access controls, manually provision security group rules. It's natural. But a target state should always be to automate. I'll give you an example. Think about your production workload, any production workload right now. So it lives in a production environment. It's got all the access controls, all the encryption controls, all the logging, all the monitoring. But before it ended up in a production environment, well, it probably started somewhere before that, in the staging environment. Before that, a QA environment. Before that, maybe a dev environment. And so maybe it's that dev environment where you manually provisioned controls, where you created users, you created policies, you created firewall rules. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. Maybe it's a web application. So you're standing up web servers and app servers and database servers and networking constructs. Well, if you're doing that manually the first time, well, you don't want to do that the second time when you promote that to QA. And you certainly don't want to do it again when you take that and move to staging and so on and so forth. It's not repeatable. It's not scalable. Your employer doesn't pay you to do repetitive tasks. Computers are good at that. These are things that can be automated, especially when it comes to security, risk, and compliance. Because if you can validate a set of security controls in a dev environment, well, then that same sort of security control set has already been validated when you promote to the other environments. So you want to get into again, from a crawl, walk, run perspective, you want to get to the run part where you are in a position where you are automating everything. Okay, A is for automate. E is for educate. Everybody, there's no asterisk here. Educate everybody. So start with your risk managers. Who owns risk in your organization? Who is responsible for ensuring that your compliance requirements are being met? Everyone? So everybody needs to understand how compliance requirements are met, especially those in your organization who need to assure that your compliance requirements are being satisfied. So if you've ever been part of any sort of compliance assessment, say a little prayer for these guys. I've been part of assessments, and gathering this information, gathering the artifacts, gathering the evidence to demonstrate to an assessor that specific compliance requirements are being met, it's not an easy job. And so we want to put you in a position where then you can ensure that those people who are responsible for that job know what they're doing, especially in AWS. And if we go to our first val, automate, we want to be able to automate that artifact generation to make that process of generating and collecting compliance artifacts that much easier. Educate your security team. So these are the ones who ensure that your teams are following security best practices, security principles. So the security team needs to know what an IAM role is. They need to know what a security group is. They need to understand what the security characteristics are of the services and features that you're using in your infrastructure. If there's a new service that's available, well, what are the security characteristics of it? How do I secure it? What options do I have? How do I configure it? Who manages that configuration? So they need to understand this. And certainly your IT staff. These are the ones who are going to get their hands dirty day in and day out, living in AWS. They need to understand, obviously, how to use AWS, how to, I don't know, automate the provisioning of a web server, or creating an S3 bucket. Very simple things. But they need to understand that. And not only do they need to understand how to do that, they need to understand what decisions they make have on compliance. Because there are very easy things to do that can violate your compliance requirements. So training and education is essential. As important as IT transformation is, personnel transformation is critical. Because these are the people who are going to be doing the work. Education and training will be critical in any sort of migration, not just initial migrations, but continuous use of AWS as well. Okay, use for educate. I is for iterate. The 3 rules of adoption are iterate, right. Iterate. So if I am somebody on an IT team, and I'm responsible then for building my infrastructure, and now I'm also tasked with ensuring that I'm following compliance requirements, well, gee, how do I do that? So I undergo my training, I undergo my education, and I continually evaluate the landscape of my system and the effect that it has on my security controls. If I were to ask you, again, pick your favorite workload right now in production, and if I were to ask you, what is that going to look like in 6 months or in a year? What's that going to look like from an application perspective or from an infrastructure perspective? I hope the answer isn't the same as it is today. Or if I ask you what it looked like 6 months ago or a year ago, chances are it looks very different. Now, at AWS, we launched, last year, 1,430 new services and features. This is 1 year alone. That is 1,430 opportunities for you to evaluate the fitness for those services and features in your infrastructure. We announced a service called Guard Duty. We announced a service called Macy. What are those? If you don't know, look them up, because these are opportunities for you to determine whether you can use these in your infrastructure and understand what risks that these services can help mitigate. And you can't do this without iterating. That is a key principle with not only use of AWS, but continued use of AWS. O is for OODA. The heck is OODA? So again, Public Sector Summit. Certainly we have some military folks here. Who can tell me what OODA means?
Observe, orient, decide.
That. Very good. I wish I had something I could give you. I'll give you good content instead. How's that? So OODA is a decision cycle created in the Air Force for fighter pilots to accelerate the decision process during combat. And like we mentioned, it stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And we can take that same principle and apply it to AWS. Observe. Observe what is happening in your infrastructure. What does that mean? Well, you're collecting information. You're collecting telemetry data in your infrastructure. You're asking questions about your infrastructure, the applications, the services that are running in your infrastructure, and you're asking them questions specifically about compliance requirements, specifically around threats, specifically around threats that could have grave impact in your organization. These are your logging and your monitoring capabilities. You can't observe what you don't collect. So as you evaluate your security posture in AWS, it begins with logging and monitoring. It also begins with identity management. It also begins with encryption, but you get the idea. So you need to understand the sources of log data that are available to you in your infrastructure. And logs are only as good as the monitoring that you do on them. So when you collect this information, when you're gathering your data observations, you need to orient yourself to determine what impact these observations have on your organization, what impact they have on your risk posture, on your compliance. After you decide what that impact is, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, it depends on the impact. If it's a minimal impact, maybe your decision is to do nothing, and so you'll act accordingly. You will do nothing. Or perhaps the impact is greater than nothing. Maybe the impact is grave. So maybe the decision then is to take some remedial action, whatever that is that you define, and then you act on it. Maybe that action is a manual intervention. But remember what A stands for? What does A stand for? Sorry, the vowel of the 5 vowels. I did not anticipate that. Automate. So automate. So we want to be in a position then where if there's a threat that is so great that it introduces a high level of threat to our organization, then we want to automate a mitigation. We want our system to automatically respond to that. I was at a customer site one time and I used the example of Skynet. I don't think that worked out too well. So I'll give you an example that's not Skynet. Let's say you have a web server in production and you open up port 443 because that's what web servers need. So an observation that your infrastructure is telling you is that, hey, there are port scans that are occurring on this web server. That's okay. That's what it's supposed to do. That is, it's available and it's accessible over the internet. So my orientation there is the impact of that port scan, it's minimal. My decision will be to do nothing, and I will act accordingly and do nothing. But let's say I have an observation in my environment. I have a log in my environment. I have a notification that's generated that says, oh, not only do you have port 443 open, but you have port 22 open for SSH. That's potentially dangerous, especially in a production web server. So if my notification, if my observation is that not only do I have port 22 open, not only is it being probed, but guess what? We are actively having a brute force attack on port 22. Geez, that sounds bad. Even if you don't know what SSH is, brute force sounds pretty bad. So I want to orient myself. The impact of that's bad. That's a high impact to my organization, to that web server, especially if that web server is managing or storing sensitive data. So my decision will be then to either, close that port, or to reduce the accessibility of that port so that anybody on the internet can access that port. So that's my decision. Now I get to act on that. My act might be manual intervention. Hey, can you close the port? Sorry, I'm on vacation. I'll be back next Tuesday. That's a bad response. So maybe in this case, because the risk is so high, the threat to my organization is so grave, that this is where I'm going to create an automated response. And again, from a crawl, walk, run perspective, this could be a target state, art of the possible. Think about the things that can be done. Think about things that you can automate, and begin to automate those. Okay. U is for understand. Understand that everything you do in AWS, should be in response to your compliance requirements. Do not do anything in your environment that is not in response to compliance requirements. That's with a really big asterisk, and that's because I'm a security guy. Generally speaking, though, you need to understand what your compliance requirements are, and you need to understand that you're going to need a brick or you're going to need a castle. So if you're creating resources, what effect does that have on your compliance requirements? Who has access to that security control? Who can create it? Who can configure it? Who can modify it? Who can delete it? If the security control is modified, who's going to know about it? Do you have a security operations center that's going to be notified of it? And if they do get notified, what are they going to do about it? So every change that's made in AWS Every control that's created or modified or configured should be logged, and there should be some sort of appropriate response based on that change to understand what effect that change has on your compliance requirements. Vice versa. If you have a requirement, whether it's NIST or PCI or what have you, if you have a new requirement, then you need to understand how you can implement that control. What control do you implement? How does it manifest in your infrastructure? Understand requirements, understand, and this goes back to educate. So yeah, your IT staff understands the effect that changes have on your compliance. AEIOU, and sometimes why. So if you have compliance requirements that specify, well, you need to encrypt your data, you need to log access, you need to enforce access control around your data, you need to have network segregation for sensitive environments, why not call that your baseline? So if you have non-sensitive workloads, does it hurt to have encryption? Does it hurt to reduce your security posture on that other workload? As long as those controls have a negligible cost impact, negligible performance impact, why not call that your security baseline? Makes sense. And because what does A stand for? A for automate? Because I'm automating the provisioning of these controls, it doesn't take anything additional then for me to establish the same set of security controls for non-sensitive data or for non-sensitive workloads. So now you can be in a position to justify, from a business perspective, reducing your security posture instead of the other way around. So I mentioned a few slides ago that I was going to come back and talk about how you can meet certain compliance requirements within AWS. And I'm on a team that created our AWS compliance QuickStarts. So you can write this link down, or you can just do a search for AWS QuickStarts. So our compliance QuickStarts comprise two things. And we have one for each of these compliance regimes, plus a few more for NIST, PCI, HIPAA, CGIS. Comprises two things. Number one, it is a set of templates, of scripts that you can automate that stand up a sample 3-tier web application, web servers, app servers, database servers, complete networking infrastructure, to demonstrate how you can meet compliance requirements in AWS. It takes about 35 minutes, I think, to launch, and you get a full 3-tier stack, functional WordPress application. So if you have a need for a NIST-compliant WordPress site, there you go. More likely than not, you can use this as reference implementation. Many customers do. So that's the first thing. The second part of the QuickStarts, and the compliance guys love this, it includes a security control matrix. It's an Excel spreadsheet that lists all of the compliance requirements for the given regime and maps very specifically for each compliance requirement the security control that's implemented by virtue of launching one of these QuickStarts. And vice versa. For every control in the QuickStart, you can map, do that crosswalk to understand how that control meets or satisfies your compliance requirements. And that's, so like I mentioned, the dirty little secret, all of the controls are the same. Encryption doesn't change because you're using NIST over PCI. Access controls don't change. The only thing that changes is how you map those to the given requirements. So I encourage you to take a look at these, evaluate them, understand how you can meet compliance requirements in AWS. But don't take my word for it. Let me introduce you to Amedeo Minutolo from ECMC Group.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amedeo, and I'm here with Rob presenting today. I'm representing ECMC Group. ECMC is one of my earlier presentations today. ECMC is a nonprofit organization that is focusing on student success. We act as a student loan guarantor for the Department of Education. And some of the things we focus heavily on are decreasing student loan default rates, also working with students to ensure they are able to successfully repay their loans. More importantly, we're trying to make sure that we can guarantee access to college systems and financial literacy information is available to students as they pursue their higher education career. ECMC's pretty much governed by two compliance and regulatory initiatives. FSMA being our most heavily governing guidelines, and also PCI DSS. So as we talk through the security and risk and compliance preparation, we've had a very interesting year and a half as we've migrated to AWS. It's been very educational for all of our teams. It's been a very good experience. To align with our FSMA requirements, we looked at really what the top initiatives were, and we focused heavily on them. To summarize up what most of the critical items are, we took the time to do our systems inventory, which aligned very much so with an application analysis, and it helped us with mapping what we have today in our on-prem data centers with what we had for potential services in AWS itself, so that we could start looking at what are we going to move, what are we going to retool, how are we going to take our compliance requirements from FSMA and PCI, are they going to be implemented in the exact same nature we do them today on premise, or are we going to look at new tool sets that meet the functional requirements of those guidelines? We've been maintaining our system security plan for a number of years. That's one of the largest control families or control documents that we must submit and adhere to continuously with our accreditor. The first thing we realized is that document is always tailored to our data center environment. It's built and it's maintained under the assumption that our data center has 4 very big brick walls. People standing at the front doors. Our man traps are in place. Cages around our data center. Network access that's isolated under the floor, in the ceilings. Nobody can get to any of it. And all of a sudden, that was a very eye-opening meeting when you have 4 people in the room and you realize that so many of the things that you traditionally rely on are now being provided to you in a shared services model. How do you go change your documentation and still show you have all those controls to an auditor who has been looking at this every year, year after year, and this is what he's used to seeing? We engaged our assessor very early on in the process to even have discussions about a move to the cloud, how that's going to change our operating model, what are they going to expect to see as we move forward through this process, and what are the things they're going to look for during an accreditation or an assessment period before we ever considered opening up our account with AWS. That was probably one of the best things we did as an organization, was go to them and ask for advice instead of taking a result set to them after it's already been implemented. Our assessor's actually been very helpful in guiding us through what we need to consider and what's going to be different from their perspective as they come back in and work with us in the future. So, our risk assessments. Rob mentioned, who owns risk in your organization? This is a very, very big question and a very valid one. We do maintain a department specifically assigned to do our risk assessments across our organization. We worked very heavily with them this last year also. One of the things that we did was, as part of our information systems inventory, we talked to all of our business partners. We went department by department and started to sit down with end users. We asked them, what do you do every day? We sat with them and looked at what websites they needed because they interfaced with another agency. We looked to see which department used a commercial off-the-shelf application that we host for them. We looked around and we talked to them about which internally developed applications each department uses. We mapped that out per department. We looked at really tying back together which ones were dependent on each other. And then we started to be able to do a risk assessment at a different level. We realized we have a lot of components in our infrastructure. When we really mapped it out, our individual service list was somewhere between 400 and 500. Started to bundle those together to figure out which ones support a business unit, and we kind of tailored things down. We ended up with about 170, 180 applications that are really supporting the business. When we started to understand what the business does and started to question, are there any requirements related to processing times? If you don't get this done for agency XYZ in 4 hours, what's the problem? If it's 8 hours, what's the problem? If it's 72 hours, does it turn into a big, big problem? Was there any compliance that was all of a sudden, is there something that we were no longer in compliance because we weren't able to do processing in a timely manner with an agency? So that helped us evaluate the risk of our application base and then individual services related to it. Along with that, it also helped us identify what do we need that's publicly available, what do we need to provide that's publicly available, what do we need to put access control on in regards to applications, because we have a very tailored user group that we may use the internet as our transport mechanism for. We've got websites, we have data that we provide. There's student loan data that we provide, there's financial information that we provide, but it's all very tailored. So just understanding from the business who our target customers were and who we interact with also helped us with our risk assessment. That risk assessment's a big driver though. And the reason being is when we look at security, all the security functions related to NIST, all the security requirements for PCI, they're complicated. There's a lot of them. Trying to keep track of them is always a challenge. So when we started to look at the controls required, the risk of a system, whether it be the risk of a system being exposed improperly or the risk of a system's unavailability, we were able to start putting together a much better mapping of this security needs to be applied to this situation, and we could walk forward through that. It gave us a better register of, as we redevelop an application for AWS, how do we include security in from the ground up build? We knew what our requirements were, we knew what our goal was, and we knew what a target was so that we could go back to our IT leadership team, our business leadership team, and our board to say we can confidently deploy this application in AWS, and we're maintaining a level of security that not only meets our compliance requirements, but also meets our internal best practices. I kind of stepped through this slide for the better part. I stepped into our business impact analysis and our risk assessment a little bit. But this really was, like I said, one of our most critical items, but very well worth the effort. Like I said, understanding the landscape, understanding the business, understanding what they need to do their job, to meet our business goals, is something that, while we try to keep up with, this is the first time we made such a large investment in really making sure that we were lockstep in sync with our business partners. Even outside of the cloud move, this was an exercise that was so massively beneficial to the organization. It's helping us with other projects, other programs, but it's really feeding all of the drivers that we need for our AWS move. It's helping us set our requirements. It's helping us set our goals. It's a very, very big component for us. And we spent I would say about a third of our preparation time moving to AWS purely on that. So I hope I have emphasized that enough to just so people understand the value in this. So. Determining the organization's risk tolerance. Again, business impact analysis, IT service audit, categorizing those into our enterprise applications were all the critical items. When we did our cross-service dependencies, the risk categorization was a direct driver so that we could map our RTO and RPOs for the first time consistently in the company's history. That was a huge achievement for us, and it was profound to our business partners because they also understood what our capabilities were to provide them service, and we knew what our requirements and what our obligations were to our business partners themselves. This was a very big change. So many times, like a lot of organizations, we may not understand the scope of the importance of something to our business partner. There are a lot of times we over-engineered things. You know, brick and mortar data center again. We had a very robust and slightly complicated configuration, but we removed so much of the data protection, data duplication, system availability requirements off the table because we had implemented a lot of high-end technology as a standard across our entire enterprise. It doesn't matter if it was, you know, someone in the lunchroom running their point of sale system or the #1 revenue generating application in the company. They both got laid on top of the same fabric. So they both had the same RTO, they both had the same RPO. Well, when something goes wrong in the lunchroom and the worst thing that they need to do is take cash over a credit card for a half an hour, do you need a $10 million solution to make sure that they're up and running in under 60 seconds, the same as you do for a multi-billion-dollar application? Probably not. So having this data really helped us tailor solutions for the application that fit what the business wanted. You didn't have to buy a Cadillac if you didn't need a Cadillac. And that's something that's been a cultural change for us. A lot of engineers, myself included, like to do the best job we can. We provide solutions that are sometimes larger than what the demand of the company requires. This at least helped us make a mind shift back to understanding the business, understanding the impact, and building what's right at the right size for the right portion of the organization. We're taking the same stance with our security posture. When we understand that the credit card machine in the lunchroom is servicing 20 cards a day and an application is serving 20 million credit card transactions a day, they have a little bit of a different security overlay. Being able to differentiate one from the other, put the right security on based on cost, based on risk, based on operational complexity was a big factor for us. And that's something we've learned a lot about in this last year. So, fault and threat isolation actually were huge deciding factors as we've come up with designs moving into AWS. One of the first things we really considered was our overall account design. We started off thinking we were going to have one AWS account, and life was going to be simple. No big deal. This is going to be easy. And then we started to ask the real questions. If someone gets an account, gets a hold of that account access, they have the ability to wipe out all of our production environment. Where are you going to run DR, and how do you guarantee that they can't do the same thing there? Okay, we're going with 2 accounts. Well, if you're going to have 2 accounts, one for DR, where are you going to store the data that you need to restore in DR? All right, maybe 3 is a better number. The developers want to be able to put applications and stand them up manually while they learn how to automate. They need sandboxes. They need areas where they can do iterative development, including infrastructure development. When you're writing infrastructure as code, you don't get it right the first time. We never have. There are some templates that I am on version 92 of right now. They're really close, finally. So we also took a couple of things into consideration in regards to blast radius. Manual changes will happen. Manual changes will fail. It is expected. It's part of the education process working in AWS or any other environment. So we did take a look and decided from a non-production perspective, we were going to provide some environments that we allowed manual changes to be made in. We were going to gate them off through separation of accounts to UAT or staging environments. It was a requirement that configuration changes had to be in some kind of a template or automated fashion to go into one of the higher level environments. So that also drove us to decide a couple more accounts were necessary. The total number is going to be determined by your organization. How complex are you? What's your risk tolerance? But think about these things, because the account structure is a gating mechanism. You can use it to your advantage. If you scale it out to the right size, it'll be beneficial to you. If you allow it to outgrow what you need, it will become a challenge to you. One of the things that helps there is the AWS organizations function. It's a very nice feature. One, gives you consolidated billing, which is very nice. So one of the things we considered with our account structure was, what are our cost centers? How do we have to do our billing back? Being able to isolate things down into 3 distinct billing buckets for different cost units, which is all we really had to break it down to, made some of our account decisions also very easy to make. Instead of having to go through monthly reporting, deciphering bills, ripping services out of different invoices, tearing this apart, we could just say, these 3 accounts are for business unit A, these 4 are for B, these 3 are for C. Here's each of the consolidated invoices, and our billing became much easier for the organization as a whole. They could see what their cost per overall business unit was, or per business line, and then from within there, different templates could be used with tags on resources to help with cost containment from an application perspective or a business unit, business department level. AWS organizations also let us manage our first level of restrictive access. Service control policies allow you to regulate what services can be used from AWS in different accounts. So we, right off the bat, went and built service control policies. Dev, test, QA environments were fairly wide open. We had a small subset of services that we knew that any usage of them would require regulatory control. So we said you're allowed to use anything in these accounts except for these 10. Next round up, we got into what's needed for the application base that we have today. So we went to a different philosophy there and called out specific services that we knew were needed to support the applications we were deploying. There's a matching set that's then deployed for production with additional restrictions as to who's allowed to use them. And then we had customized policies specifically for audit and compliance. Centralized logging accounts. We have S3 buckets. Our centralized logging is there. Enforcing encryption, enforcing specific KMS key usage, and all the way down to individual calls to the S3 bucket. All the accounts are allowed to write into them. No one anywhere is allowed to delete. Lifecycle management's the only way to enforce any kind of data retention on those logs and audit trails. And that was done very intentionally. VPC and account design was one of the last ones. Use your VPCs accordingly. They separate out the environments well. We have more VPCs than we have for accounts. That was done intentionally because we have multiple non-prod environments. We use multiple VPCs in a single non-prod account. Our network design is very much influenced by our compliance also. There's a lot of drivers around where do we inspect traffic, what do we do with it, how do we manage it, how can we control it, where do we need security groups, where do we need access lists. All of those things support so many of our control families that we need to do. So we took those into consideration as we did the network design per VPC within the accounts and also overall in the AWS infrastructure. And then the application and service design is obviously one of the most critical components. If you put security as close to the application as you can and you couple it as tightly as you can in the application, we realized our end result always ends up better. Don't shoehorn in security. Have them help from day one. Tell them what you're doing. Have them tell you what they need so you can take it into account while you're doing your builds. That's the most important thing. So I'm going to pick up the pace. I know I'm running a little behind. Maybe. Thank you. There we go. Going to fast track through a couple of things that'll be very important as you kind of look at this. We're big for us too. Can you automate account provisioning early? This is actually a huge one. We decided internally, we built accounts, we used the root account to get it stood up, put the proper information in, lock that down, throw away the key. We immediately created roles with the right permissions to automate or at least execute everything else without having anything tied to individual users. There are dependencies that get created there if you don't do this. We wanted to make sure that no one person or no one entity in general turned into a lock on a particular resource or something in the environment because they were no longer there. Or, more importantly, just a user ID, a user entity was no longer there. So that was something that we decided very early. Federation is definitely a huge consideration very early on. Are you going to use something to federate your account access? I would highly suggest it. We debated between using an existing Active Directory Federation service and AWS's SSO service. We elected to go with an AWS native service and use SSO as our starting point. It has some constraints that you have to work within, but we've been able to work through those very easily. Again, a little bit of a thought process change. The QuickStarts are definitely something I'm going to put some emphasis on. The NIST QuickStart itself was our baseline for developing our FSMA environment. Initially, we were going to use that as our target deployment. We realized we've added a lot of security controls and best practice controls on top of it, but the underlying architecture that was deployed in that baseline and the security control matrix that's provided with it is still the baseline for what we've done. So it's been very helpful. Please consider them. AWS does a great job keeping them updated, and they also provide supplemental CIS baseline information that can be overlaid on top of it to help augment the security controls even further. CloudFormation, whether it's CloudFormation or another tool, again, automate, use templates. Anytime something is built, treat it as a service. That's an important factor. Whatever you build needs to be reusable, needs to be redeployable. So anything you build, consider it a factory. You want to figure out how to build 100 of anything. Even if you only use it once, figure out how to build it 100 times exactly the same. CloudFormation and other tools will help with that. Leverage them to the extent you can. It'll help the environment as a whole, and it'll help your teams. And then the last part, which we're growing into, this is part of the crawl, walk, run, is pipelines, deployment pipelines. AWS is an application. Never forget that. It allows for all the manual items to be created. You can utilize that to the extent you want, but at the end of the day, the more mature you get, the more you treat the entire environment as if it's an application. You write code, you check in code, you use build pipelines, you use resource pipelines to deploy this. The more of that occurs, the less your error rate gets reduced. You end up with more consistent results and a more reliable environment, and we've seen that. All right. There we go. Last point, I'll keep this brief too. What are you required to accomplish? Security compliance is a baseline. We have also our own that we lay on top of it, but at the end of the day, you need measurable goals. Take your security controls. They need to be broken down into tangible items, an actionable task that needs to be completed. After those are defined, look at the technology that can support those goals. Don't pick technologies and use them as the baseline for what you need. I myself fell into this very awkward circle. I'm very comfortable with technologies. So are many of the engineers with us. We spent so much time trying to retrofit data center technologies that worked exceptionally well for us for years into AWS to finally come to the determination that it's a great tool, but it might not be the right one in AWS, and we had to go back and distill our requirements into business functions. When we went back and looked at it from that perspective, we started making very educated and calculated decisions on what tools, whether it be AWS provided or third-party provided, were really the right fit for the organization, taking into consideration the new landscape. That was a very hard thing to work through because that's a culture change. I don't like this clicker, Rob. Look at solutions as cattle, not pets. Everybody's heard that phrase with AWS. Security solutions are no different. Set your goal, then pick the technology. Treat it as another module. It's another tool in the toolbox like anything else. There's going to be the day when that tool is going to wear out. You're going to have to replace it. Know what it does for you. Understand that, because when you need to replace it, that's what you need to do again. You don't want to find a tool to replace all the functionality of another tool if you only use 20% of it. That's a bad baseline to set, and that's part of our learning curve right now too. Security does tend to be religious. Everybody knows that. Operational change is the #1 issue, or challenge, I should say. Again, people have skills already developed, and they are phenomenal. Helping them understand that changing how they do something does not change what they need to do for the company. Helping them work through that is part of developing an education and training program very early on. They need to be involved. They need to know changes are coming. They need to be able to help influence these changes. And part of influencing the changes is also educating themselves so that they can still give good feedback and good advice to the leadership team. They will feel engaged. They will feel part of the process. That's how you retain our people, or that's how we're retaining our people, and that's been critical. So the last thing is just to remember, traditional data centers are not the same as AWS. You can do what you do in a data center in AWS. You will have to change how you do it in certain cases. It's okay. It still can meet our compliance. It still meets our security requirements. These are all things that we are working our way through, and we've worked through a lot of it. But again, get your people on board so they understand that the change is necessary, but good for the company and for them, to help them advance their careers just as much as it is for the company to be able to advance in technology. Okay. We are down to the last couple of minutes. We're done? All right. So I apologize for running over. If anybody'd like to discuss anything we've talked about, Rob and I will be out back. We want to thank everybody for attending. And if you guys have a chance, please take the time to fill out the survey after the session. Appreciate it, everyone. Thank you.